Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Julio Anta to discuss his debut comic book series, Home, published by Image Comics. Julio Anta is a writer based in New York City. Raised in Miami in a Cuban and Colombian family, his writing focuses on the intersection of Latinx identity and American life. Forthcoming work includes Frontera, a YA graphic novel from Harper Alley, and Si Se Puede, an adult nonfiction graphic novel from 10 Speed Press. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Alex Segura, an acclaimed award-winning writer of novels, comic books, short stories, and podcasts. He's the author of the upcoming noir novel Secret Identity, coming in March from Flatiron Books. By day, he is the Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Oni Press, with previous stints at Archie Comics and DC Comics. He's a Miami native who is now based in New York City. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And remember to order your copy of Home from Books and Books below. Thank you for supporting indie bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello. All right. How's it going?
Good. You know, I was going to mention this when we were in the green room earlier, but I think this is our first time like face to face actually.
I know it's so bizarre.
Or virtually meeting.
It's nice to meet you.
But we've been talking for a while, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that kind of the same way you always have a friend in Miami, or you always meet, whenever you run into someone, you always have a friend in common. I feel like we've been kind of chatting in the way you just support people. You support other authors and support other, Latinx creators, or at least I try to, and I know you do as well, just to kind of keep that community going. But I'm excited to be here. I love Books and Books, and I know you have really fond memories of Books and Books from your time in Miami. But to me, it's such a big part of growing up in Miami and being a book lover and the book fair. And I was so bummed to not be there this year, but I feel like now we kind of are there in our own little way.
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was telling you both earlier. I grew up spending hours at the Lincoln Road store while my parents shopped around. Same at the Coral Gables store. It's a fixture in Miami. So it's an honor to like come full circle and have this event on the day that my graphic novel comes out, in bookstores. So
happy publication day.
Thanks.
It's amazing. It's a great store, and it's such a landmark part of Miami. So I want to hear your origin story, not to get all superhero-y, but I'd love to hear, just what's the 101 on your career. And I know Home is your first major comic book, but I'd love to hear like how you got to this point.
Yeah, sure. So like a lot of people my age, I think I discovered comics through manga and anime. So for me, I grew up on my uncle bringing me VHSs from Colombia of Dragon Ball Z episodes, because they were ahead. South America has, for I don't know the reason, but for some reason they've always been ahead of anime when it was like coming to be in the US for the first time. So that was like my introduction to like anime and manga. And then one day a friend of mine at school told me about this anime store, which some of you watching might be familiar with it. It was called Anime Hurricane. It was across the street from FIU. And that store was my first experience with American, DC Marvel comics, because it was mainly an anime store, but they had an American, direct market comic section. And around that time, I believe it was when Marvel was doing Civil War.
Oh, wow.
So that was really like my intro to those kinds of comics. I think by then I'd seen like the Spider-Man movies, and I watched like the X-Men animated series and all of that. But my first time ever buying like floppy issues was in that store. So, from that moment on, I think like a lot of people, there's been like peaks and valleys and like how invested you are in comics. But really, for the rest of my life, I've been reading comics. And then I think, like a lot of people at a certain point, you've read enough comics, you're like, I think I might be able to do this. And eventually, when I kind of had the inspiration for Home, which we can talk about also, I decided to just kind of dive in and try to teach myself how to write comics.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, it's so funny. Like we were talking in it sounds so fancy to say the green room, which is really just this room, but not live. But we were talking about we have a slight age difference, like a decade. But you were introduced into comics at such a different time, because I remember as a fan, like reading Spider-Man and reading comics, but also there was this huge divide between media and movies and the kind of proliferation of comic book IP that there is today. And I think when you came in, it was happening. You know, we were kind of in the first wave, which is so interesting to me. Mainly because like Secret Identity is about a time in comics where comics were basically dead, like the mid 70s, like there was no comic shops or things like that. So anyway, it's interesting. But so I didn't realize that Home was your first attempt at writing comics. That's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, Home was my first time. So I guess to go back a little bit, I started publishing a lot of short stories online for free, like on Instagram and Twitter. But really, that was all in service of trying to get Home off the ground.
Right.
The moment that I decided to try to write comics was the moment I had the idea for Home. But you know, I started doing research because I didn't know, you know, what the first thing to do was. I didn't know how how writers wrote comics, the scripting format or anything like that. I wasn't even really too familiar with like 3-act structure or, you know, really like concepts of story other than what you get naturally from watching movies and reading books and comics and everything. So I picked up Brian Michael Bendis's book on writing comics, and that was kind of my first introduction. I started like reading interviews and listening to podcasts with other creators. And one of the things that a lot of them really came back to was to start with short stories, which I think is like the same tenet of like, you want to be a director, start with short films. You know, you don't start with your, you know, 3-hour, you know, epic film. And that's the same advice that I kept seeing. You know, you don't start off with your 300-page graphic novel. You start off with short stories.
Right.
So that's what I did. I put out, before Home came out, I released like 5 different 4 to 10 page stories. And it was my way of learning
on social media.
Comics. Yeah, just for free. I'd put them on Twitter, and then I'd link to my website where you could read it also. And it was my way of learning how to write comics, but also like learning how to collaborate with other people, with artists that I'd find. And also, you know, I knew that all of this was in service to Home. So I wanted publishers, when I did go out and pitch Home, to at least see that I've done something before, that I've told a story, I finished it, I've been able to work with the artist, and I'm not just somebody who's never done anything, you know? So it kind of felt like an easier way in than just trying to start off with this miniseries idea for Home.
I think there's so much truth in your process there, because I think so many people who are starting out think, well, let me just work on my first thing and then just shop it around, and people are just going to be so blown away by the genius that they'll buy it. But it really helps to become part of the community you want to live in, kind of. You know, you engage with people, you do some work, and then you kind of dip your toe in. But before we get into talking about Home, I want to remind everyone that's watching that you can buy Home, the graphic novel, by clicking on that giant green button under us. And if you have questions, there's a button called Ask a Question, and I'll read some of them, and we'll go back and forth once my initial grilling is over. But let's talk through the inspiration of Home, because it's such it's a pure concept, but it's not. It's so unique. You know, I haven't seen a lot like it. You know, I think there's a lot of stories with Latinx protagonists and a lot of stories that happen to deal with the border crisis, but you blend a lot of elements of comics into something. It just feels very pure, and I was really excited when I first read about it. Before I'd even met you, I was like, this is cool. This is really like an evocative concept. So I'd love to hear how you got there.
Yeah. You know, so I guess I mean, for anybody who's read it or knows anything about the book, I'll give the quick elevator pitch for it.
Yeah.
It's a graphic novel about a young boy separated from his mother at the border, just as superhuman abilities begin to manifest inside of him. So most people hear that, and it's very obvious that it's in response to and inspired by the zero tolerance policy from the previous administration, child separation. So like a lot of people in the spring of 2018, I found out about family separation and I was just horrified. We'd later find out that it was kind of pilot tested a year prior to that, right at the beginning of the Trump administration. And for me, kind of like you, I am, my father was or is a Cuban exile, came to the US in the 60s when he was 5 years old. And then on my mother's side, my mother was born here, but she's the daughter of undocumented immigrants from Colombia, previously undocumented. So these are two like very different experiences, one that is, as we all know, much more of a privileged experience with really like a fast track towards being able to stay in the country. And one where family members of mine lived in the shadows, lived in hotels, went from one hotel to another when they found, when they heard rumors and gossip of immigration coming around. So hearing about family separation was really like this new low for me, because I do come from a very, pessimistic view of the way that this country treats immigrants in the past. Not just Latino immigrants, but, Japanese, Chinese. We were just coming off the Muslim ban as well at the time. So I already came in with this kind of pessimistic view, but then seeing child separation as this, cruel and vindictive way of trying to, send the message to the world, which was don't come here.
Yeah.
Was just a gut punch for me, because I saw my father as a 5-year-old in the eyes of these kids. I saw my son. I was a new parent at the time. My son was 3 when this was happening. And, it hit me really hard. And
I think our sons are close in age, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. My son just turned 7. So at the time he was 3, and like, I kind of like dove right into all of what was going on. Just like listening to interviews with families, going after like local news from the area, in Texas and Arizona where this was happening. And really in this weird, like, I guess, way of trying to cope with my feelings, I just dove into it. And then eventually I had the idea for Home, and it kind of felt for the first time like I had a positive way to deal with these emotions that I was having. So that's really where the idea came about. And then I just started developing it from there.
Yeah, it's you said something that really resonated with me, this sense of kind of desperation, or it was almost like a new low, but it's not a singular moment. Like, I think a lot of people have this concept of American, not imperialism, but just this belief that everything America's done has been amazing. And there's actually a very sordid track record of both parties. I think it's safe to say mismanaging the borders or mismanaging immigration. And I think it's so sad, because it's a country that's literally built on immigration. Like that's the big conceit of our country.
Can you talk to? No, I was just going to say to your point before. I think this country has done like a really good job at marketing itself as this, like, these are what American ideals are. And a lot of people saw family separation and they thought this is not who we are. We're supposed to be a nation of immigrants. When in reality, like you said, this is not this exact thing where we're separating families at the border who are seeking asylum, going through a legal process. But we have separated families in the past. Japanese families were put in internment. All sorts of things have happened through both parties.
Yeah.
So, for me, this was, like I said, just like this new low. And I guess as a father and as the child of immigrants was just like a difficult thing to see.
Yeah, it was heart-wrenching as a parent and as a person, as a human. It guts you. And then also I think there was that sense of like, well, what next? Like, it was such a, I think people are really experiencing whiplash now, because we're in this kind of calmer period. Not calmer, I mean, we're in a pandemic, but I mean in terms of like the news cycle, like it felt like every day there was some kind of new chaos. But so you got us to the inspiration, but how did did you then put it together? Like, did you have any friends that you knew that worked in comics that were like, you should check out this artist, or you should pitch to this editor? Like, who were like your guides through this process?
Yeah, I mean, it was like I said, it was a lot of research and a lot of doing things that I probably wouldn't recommend to other people, but
Yeah.
that just like happened to work out for me. So the artist on this book, Anna Wieszczyk, Polish artist, artist who had been published before. This was my first published work, but she'd been published by Black Mask, by Boom. I met her on Reddit,
Oh,
which
wow.
I don't think is like a normal way for like an image book to come together. But there's this subreddit called Comic Book Collabs where people can, writers can put up like a little log line and say like, I'm looking for an artist with this kind of style. Or an artist can say, I'm looking for a writer because I want to like build up a portfolio or whatever. And yeah, so I did that, which is kind of my first experience with the backlash that I would get from like certain parts of the internet with this story, because it's Reddit. So initially, there was a lot of artists who were like, oh, this sounds interesting. But right away, I started getting some of those trolls coming into the comments already.
Yeah.
But Anna was one of those artists, and she ended up being the perfect artist for this. I think her style, for those of you who haven't seen the book, it's very, it's stylized kind of like animated cartoons kind of style, very flat. But I think with a book like this that can get pretty bleak and pretty dark sometimes, having her art, which is not, hyper realistic, I think makes it a little bit easier to get through the book and in some of the darker portions.
Yeah, definitely. I think the clash of like the simple, not cartoony, but more comic booky style as opposed to realistic or overly gritty, showing you these dark moments. It's like the contrast, I think, lets you get through it. But so then the process for you, what was that like, that first like script writing? You said you were kind of learning as you go. Like,
yeah.
So I'm just so curious about, I'm so impressed, and so it's so cool that this was your first like major project. So what was the learning curve for you?
So like I mentioned earlier, I had the idea for Home. Started like researching a lot, and then I kind of put it to the side and started doing short stories. So by the time I start pitching Home to publishers, I've already put out 3 short stories of varying lengths. I've already like kind of started to get my feet wet, meeting people, reaching out to people like just through Twitter DMs and like showing it to them. And, those who responded well to it asked if they could share it also. And that's how I kind of started like getting involved in this community, which is how I would end up meeting Brian Valenza, who did the colors, and Hassan Otsmain El How, who did the letters. Because he lettered all of my short stories that I've done. He's lettered every project that I've done at this point. And we've built a really good relationship of like what I'm looking for, what he's looking for, and like really collaborating as a writer and a letterist, which I don't think a lot of people think about. But that's been a really great experience. But then, we haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm a student of yours with your pitching class. So, I kind of had an idea as to what a pitch looked like. I had found, examples of pitches online that other creators have shared publicly. But then I took your class, which we kind of, not to make this sound like a commercial now, but
brought to you by,
yeah, it was a virtual class, right? I think this was in 2019 that I did it. And, you kind of lay out what, you as somebody who worked at a publisher, but also as a writer of comics, what should be included in each pitch, what are all the sections of a pitch and the story that they should tell. And then part of it also was you explaining how to approach editors. So I came out of that class with the pitch that I used to show publishers, essentially.
It's really amazing. It's just amazing to see someone that was in the class actualize the work of the class, because that validates. I mean, I'm not taking credit at all. Like your talent took you where
You
you're going.
definitely deserve some of the credit.
No, but it's so cool that it's cool for me as a teacher to like see that, okay, maybe I'm onto something like that, because it's a very workman-like course. It's not meant to be like theoretical. It's like literally these are the buckets you fill.
Yeah.
This is what you put in each bucket, and then it becomes this thing. But I remember, you're it's just cool to see, and that's exciting. And I totally agree with you about having a letterer or have any part of the creative team. Like when you find a collaborator that clicks, you want to work with them forever, because there's so many, especially in comics, there's so many times where for whatever reason it just doesn't land. It doesn't work. But I do want to talk about one part of the book that I think maybe when people first read about it, maybe they jump to conclusions and start thinking about superheroes or some tropes. But the fact that superpowers are an element, like how did you decide to do that? And was there any trepidation about it, just based on like the output of comics these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the reasoning behind the superhuman aspect of it is kind of twofold. One of them is that this was a single issue comic going to the direct market. Now it's in a trade paperback at bookstores, but it was initially released as single issues. And obviously in the direct market in comic shops, it's mostly a superhero game, So I wanted to write a story that kind of spoke to that audience, because like you mentioned before, there's definitely a history of Latinx characters, and there's Latinx creators doing really good work. But I think when you look at media as a whole, and I think comics suffer from this even more so, we very rarely get anywhere close to the amount of representation that is equivalent to our portion of the population, which is nearly 20% of the US population, and even less to the amount of dollars that Latinos spend in media, whether it's books, movies, comics, whatever. We're so underrepresented. So for me, as someone who came up in comics and loves comics, and I'm somebody who still goes every Wednesday to comic shops and picks up my pool. I wanted to kind of walk in that legacy of other Latinx creators and Latino characters, and tell this story to that audience that so rarely gets to hear something like this. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it was just my love for the genre, and wanting to kind of be part of that legacy of immigrant as superhero. Which, I think nowadays, despite Superman being like one of the most iconic characters in the history of comics, and literally being this immigrant character, I think it's like we rarely see that. Like, we don't see new characters introduced as immigrants. There's very little legacy characters that are immigrants. So for me, I wanted to just be part of that and try to speak to that audience in a way that they understand. So
I mean, I totally get that, obviously, and it's something I try to do with my work as well. Just and I think it's one of the reasons we do what we do, because we kind of want to create more visual connections or experiential connections that we didn't have as readers. I mean, when I was reading crime novels, I didn't read any with like a Latinx protagonist, and so I thought, let me just make one. And in terms of superheroes, it's really, you want to be additive and kind of expand the pool, because hopefully the next person in the generation is going to see that there are more, and that's going to inspire hopefully more people. But what can you tell us about your protagonist, and just kind of the, what went into his creation, and were there any real world, before that, actually, remember to buy the book, click on the button below, and ask any questions, because we're going to get to the questions soon. But I want to hear more about the protagonist and just kind of what went into creating him, and any real world inspiration there.
Yeah. So the protagonist, his name is Juan. And, at the start of the book, Juan is about 10 years old. Very much the kind of kid that I was as a 10-year-old, which was, really shy, clinging to his mom, and then his whole world was ripped apart before the book starts. And we learn, through flashbacks, the reasons that led to their migration, and why they would come to the US to seek asylum. But, when I started thinking about what superhuman abilities to give him, because I think you mentioned earlier, it's a book with superpowers, but it's not a superhero book.
Right.
I wanted his superpowers to really be an external manifestation of his internal struggles and his internal feelings, which are feelings of lack of control. He had no control over why his family had to leave his home. He had no control over why his mother was separated for him, or why he was sent to a detention center for children. So in those moments when we first see those superpowers, it's totally out of control. It's wild. It's triggered by his stress. And then later in the book, when we see those few moments where he does have some semblance of home, some semblance of control, his superhuman abilities get more controlled, and he's able to really focus them a lot more. So that was really the inspiration towards Juan, but it was also through listening to a lot of these interviews. There's one moment in issue 3 where Juan and his mother, they've been separated, and now they're on the phone for the first time, having their first conversation since they were ripped away from each other. And it's really based off of this podcast that I listened to, where they had a woman who was separated from her son at the border. This was, I believe she was separated from him in Arizona. And her kid ended up being found in the Bronx
Wow.
in, a foster home situation. And it was really only through the help of a nonprofit organization that she was able to track down her son. Because as we all remember, or those who don't, this was a really haphazard process. Like, aside from being cruel and just really evil, it was also just done without any preparation, without any way of reuniting these families. There's still, I think, right over 1,000 kids who still haven't been reunited with their parents, and we're going on almost 4 years this coming March.
Yeah, it's really shameful.
Yeah. So, that scene was inspired by the first time this woman got to speak to her child. And it was, there's an audio recording of it where she's saying, "I'm so sorry for ever bringing you here. If I knew, I would have never done it." And she's just apologizing and apologizing. And, all that's on this kid's mind is, when are we going to be back together again?
Yeah.
And I was listening to this on the train platform on the way to work one morning, and I just broke down,
Yeah.
because in this kid's voice, I heard my son, and I think a lot of people love to talk about the lengths that they go to, do anything for their children and, keep them safe. But then they struggle to understand why a family would cross borders and go on a month-long journey across land and trains to seek a better life for their children. So, for me,
Yeah, I mean, it's a great privilege to not
yeah,
understand what that's like.
yeah, and then also, like, for our family history, like,
Mhm.
from, my Cuban background to, the Cuban side of my family has never had to wonder if they would have to go back to
Yeah.
Cuba. Their only thought about going back to Cuba is, when are we going to be able to return to see the people that we left behind? It's not, am I going to get sent back? It's one day, when the regime ends, hopefully we can go back and see people.
Right.
They've never had to worry about that kind of thing. So, part of writing this book was also to hopefully build empathy with people, who have never had to think about this. And maybe they can meet this character, and, this character that's built off of real experiences that people were experiencing, within the last few years. And, maybe they can empathize with them a little more.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely succeed at that, and it never feels like you're never playing it for the emotional beat. I mean, it feels natural. It feels like we're getting a peek into this real human experience, and it's really touching and well done. Did you always envision it as only this miniseries, or is there potential for more? Or, like, what was your big kind of grand plan for it?
Yeah, I mean, in all of, like, the research and talking to other creators, I knew that I couldn't kind of, like, come out of the gate with, like, an ongoing series. So I pitched this as a mini series.
Mhm.
Those of you who have read it know that there's, a cliffhanger at the end.
Yeah, I don't want to
Um,
spoil anything, but
yeah. So, it's one of those things where I wrote most of it. So just for a little context, Image picked up this book right before the pandemic hit in February of 2020. So we were planning on launching it in November of 2020. Pandemic pushed everything back. We didn't launch until April of this year. But that gave us a lot of time. You know, by the time our first issue came out, we had 4 issues in the can already.
Yeah.
And Anna was working on the 5th issue. And as we started seeing, you know, that the book was doing well and that there was really an audience for it, I kind of changed a little bit of the final issue from what my plan was initially, just to give us room to continue on in the future. So there's definitely plans, nothing I could talk about right now, but yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's good to hear that there's a little flicker of potential there. I want to hear more about your fandom as a reader and as a you know, a relatively new creator. Like, who are the writers and artists that you read that just got you psyched, that inspired, maybe directly inspired home, or just inspire you as a creator yourself?
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, when I was younger, it was really about characters, not creators, right?
Oh,
So like,
interesting.
you know, I grew up, you know, actually, I mentioned that, you know, Marvel Civil War is my first interaction with single issues, but actually, Sonic the Hedgehog, when he was published by Archie,
Yeah.
was I'd pick him up at like Eckerd Drugs, like at the spinner rack and
Oh,
at gas
Eckerd. Yeah, that's
stations.
where I'd get my comics as a kid too.
Yeah, so that was actually my first experience, but it wasn't in like that big 2 superhero world, Marvel, DC.
Right.
So like as a kid, like I loved Sonic the Hedgehog. That was like one of my characters. I played the Sega Genesis games. And then as I got older, you know, characters like Miles Morales were a character that I would read and continue to read monthly.
Hmm.
But then as I started like getting older, and then especially now when I started like wanting to write comics, some of the creators that like really inspired me are Jeff Lemire.
Yeah.
You know, for me, I love like how you know, I love how prolific he is, which is part of like the inspiration behind my work of like wanting to do a lot of work. But also
I don't
just
know how
like,
he does it. Like, and I'm fairly
I
prolific too,
know.
but he just puts out so much. He's just so fast and so good. Like, everything is of high quality too. It's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. You know, he kind of reminds me of like the old like pulp writers, you know, how
Yeah.
they were just like, you know, four pulp novels a year, you know.
Yeah. Just making the donuts, you know, just like cranking
Yeah,
it out, and it's all good. Yeah.
yeah. So he's one of them, because he just keeps like he ties like these emotional stories into these characters that some of them are legacy characters that have
Hmm.
never really had like these highly emotional stories. But his creator own work for me is huge. And another big one for me is Brubaker and Phillips. You know, I love all the
Yeah.
work that they do. Again, like the prolific work, but also this team that found themselves, you know, and have kept doing a lot of work. And for me, that's really kind of been my MO since I started doing comics, like finding my people and continuing to work with them. One of those people is Jacoby Salcedo, who I did my second short story with, The Price of Freedom.
Hmm.
And we've since done we've done 3 short stories together. Right now, he's illustrating our YA graphic novel debut Frontera. It's a 250-page graphic novel.
That's
I
awesome.
wrote it last year, and he's almost done. He's going to be done in a few months, illustrating it. And then we've already got more projects going. So like for me, he's my Sean Phillips. You
That's
know,
good.
like he's become one of my best friends, and like we're just constantly talking about stories. But now that I've started to like work in the YA space, some of the big ones for me are people like Tilly Walden.
Yeah.
I love her work. I'm just like in awe of her, and what she's doing. But yeah, so you know, it's like it's kind of like I view my work in kind of these buckets. So like Home is one of my like direct market single issue series. But then I have like my YA works that I'm doing now. And she mentioned earlier Si Se Puede, which is a nonfiction book. So I kind of
Hmm.
like see these in their own different buckets, and I approach them in their own specific ways. And then I draw inspiration from like creators who are doing
Yeah.
similar work, you know?
No, I mean, you're actualizing probably the one bit of advice I try to give to writers is don't pin everything on one thing. You know, like diversify your output. Like for me, it's like I'll do comics, I'll do novels, I'll do short stories, I'll do a
Mm-hmm.
podcast, but even those things are in different spaces. Like I'll do a Star Wars book or I'll do a crime
Mm-hmm.
novel, and it's important to be flexible because some things will resonate and some things won't. But if you're producing and you're creating this body of work, that in and of itself, you never know when something is going to click with somebody. So
Yeah,
somebody
definitely.
may find you through a short story like 10 years from now, and then they'll backtrack and read your entire library of work. So it's really, that's kind of what they're all entry points, is my point, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with you, like yours are even like more diverse, podcasts. Like I'd be really interested to hear about the people who discover your work in podcasts and then, make it over to your comic series. That's so
it's
interesting to me.
interesting. Yeah. And it's, we should just sit and chat, I guess, at some point now that we've officially like virtually met. But I mean, it's also to keep us interested, and I'm sure it's the same for you. Like you do it different things because you get bored of doing the same thing all the time. You want to like keep yourself on your toes.
Yeah, definitely. And they all inform each other, like with Si Se Puede, it was a book that required a lot of research, like a lot of research about figures that I knew about already. Essentially, the book is about, the subtitle is The Latino Heroes That Changed America. So we kind of go on a journey through important Latino figures in American history.
That's great.
And how they impact the country. And while doing that, it's researching people I know like Selena, J-Lo, Rita Moreno, but then it's also about discovering these new people that I'd never heard of. People like Ellen Ochoa, who's the first Latino to go to space.
Wow.
And then in that, discovering people that I'm now using for another book that, will hopefully see the light of day soon. And I can kind of talk a little bit more about that then, but everything informs each other, so I don't think it's just about readers finding their entry point. It's also like I found my entry point to a new book while writing another one,
Yeah, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm so happy that we've been able to kind of like just talk shop. It's been very chill, but for me, the best art asks questions. It doesn't necessarily provide answers, and I think Home does that in a very meaningful way. It raises some important questions, but I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit. Like, you're tackling something so important head on, and you don't really pull any punches, but you do it with artistry. You made thoughtful choices on the visuals and how the narrative would unfurl. So what would you love readers to take away from this book?
Yeah. I think like you mentioned, it asks a lot of questions, but it doesn't necessarily give the answers. I think one of the examples of that is as the issues go on, we kind of start opening up this world of Juan's family. And within his family, there's these intergenerational arguments and debates about what the right way forward is, and obviously there is a history of that in comics with Professor X and Magneto. But it's like, I think it's something that goes on within our families too. The older generation that maybe they made specific choices based on, what was the best way for them to survive and to just make it in America. And with younger generations, a lot of us at least are starting to think like, no, like we need to fight back a little bit. We need to use our voices in a way that, the earlier generations didn't necessarily have that privilege or that security to do that. So that's one of the conversation that goes on in the book. But for your question about like what I want readers to take away from it, I think I want them to just see a story that is not meant to be a monolith in any way, a story that's just about one specific family's experience and how they deal with it, and the debates and the conversations that they have and the hard choices that they have to make. And how really at the end of the day, there's a lot of politics like in the background of this book, but it's really not about the politics. It's about how those politics impact the life of one child. And I think that's something that just in general with American politics, that it becomes so zero sum and, tribal and one team versus the other. We kind of forget how these things impact,
people,
real people. Yeah.
It's very true. It's very true. And I'm so glad you mentioned the X-Men, at least tangentially, because I got that vibe, it just somewhat from reading the book, but this has been great. I've had a great time chatting with you. I think everyone should check out this book. It's fantastic. I was reading it in single issues as they came out, but now it was fun to revisit it as a whole, and it really holds together nicely as a standalone graphic novel. And I'm just honored you asked me to MC this because, Books and Books is such a special place, and to have this party here, albeit virtually, has been really cool.
Yeah, no, and it's an honor to talk to you, be hosted by Books and Books. Thank you so much to both of you.
My pleasure.
And thank you to both of you, because I learned so much. That was a fascinating conversation.
Oh, good.
Alex, you're a great
Good.
moderator.
Oh, thanks.
And Julio, you gave like thoughtful and insightful answers. I feel like I know this work so much better, and I know you both so much better. So thank you so much. Thanks to all the viewers watching. Remember, you can order your copy of Home by pressing the green button. But you can also come to any of our stores, and we have it there too. Thank you. Thanks for holding it up. Beautiful. Congratulations on this wonderful
It's really great
work. And I hope that we're going to see you both soon in Miami. Maybe
for sure.
Do this
Definitely.
in person, and definitely, we want to just like keep in touch and hear about everything that you're doing.
For sure.
Okay.
Definitely.
Wonderful. Then
thanks so much.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Have a restful holiday.
Okay.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.